All right. I guess we have a small crowd. So we're going to discuss violence, or at least the threat of violence. And the story is told in two different ways in the two different Talmuds, in the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. In the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, this section takes up 8 pages, which is an extraordinarily long sugya. It's an extremely unusual length. So in the Babylonian Talmud, the sages of the Sanhedrin went to visit Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Garon, who was ill. And he's famous in the Talmud for preserving Sefer Yechezkel, which is an extremely esoteric text. And many of the rabbis of the Talmud objected to the canonization of Sefer Yechezkel for that reason. But he defeated all their arguments, and so that's what he's most famous for. The other thing that's unusual about the story is it relates to 18 laws that were enacted by the disciples of Beit Shammai, which is extremely unusual because usually the halakha in the Talmud, it follows Beit Hillel, not Beit Shammai, and the disciples of Hillel rather than the disciples of Shammai. But the other thing that's unusual in this section of the Talmud is that only one of the 18 laws is discussed in any detail. The other is just the laws given, and the vote happened, and it was adopted. They relate to highly technical matters, and the one that's discussed in detail is whether grapes can convey ritual impurity. And there's kind of this notion of flow. So liquids can create ritual impurity. The other background is that there are different theories on when this occurred in Jewish history. One theory is that it happened while Hillel and Shammai, the last of the two, the Talmud has these zugot, these pairs of rabbis who had intellectual arguments with one another. Hillel and Shammai were the last of the zugot, last of these pairs. And so that would mean that would happen when Herod was still alive, but the other theory is that it happened during the Great Revolt before the destruction of the Second Temple. And in fact, there was a sect of Beit Shammai, the Kanaim, who were a faction of Shammai, who did engage in the armed revolt against the Romans. So it's potentially the case, and we'll see that notion is probably consistent with the Jerusalem Talmud's version of events. So let's quickly go through this. I'm just going to read the Jerusalem Talmud's version. The Mishnah says, "These are the practices that were pronounced at the upper floor of Hananiah ben Chizkiah ben Garon when they came to visit him. This day was hard for Israel, like the day on which the golden calf was made." Rabbi Eliezer said, Rabbi Eliezer was a very, very strict Talmudist. On that day, they filled the bushel to overflow. Rabbi Joshua, who often disagreed with Eliezer, said, on that day, they filled the bushel to the rim. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, if it was deficient and they filled it, it would have been reasonable, as with an amphora full of nuts. If you fill it with sesame seeds, it will be strengthened. Rabbi Joshua said to him, if it had been full and they diminished it, it would have been reasonable, as with an amphora filled with oil. If you add water to it, it dilutes the oil. Rabbi Joshua from Ono stated, the students of the house, and here we get to the key, the students of the house of Shammai were standing downstairs and killing the students of the house of Hillel. It was stated 6 of them went up, the rest were standing around with swords and lances. It was stated 18 things they decided, in 18 they were majority, and 18 they were divided. So one of the commentators says that 3,000 disciples of Hillel died on that day, which is an obvious reference to the golden calf story. The Bavli has it differently. Hillel quite innocently asked Shammai why he ruled that juice that emanates from grapes being transported to a wine press causes impurity, whereas similar liquid from olives do not. For unexplained reasons, Shammai did not take kindly to the question. He said to him, "If you provoke me, I will decree impurity on the gathering of olives as well," which is kind of obnoxious, right? A sword was struck in the study hall, and they said, "Let the enterer enter, yet the one who seeks to leave may not leave." That day Hillel sat submissively before Shammai like one of the students, and it was grievous to Israel as the day the golden calf was made. So the only thing that's similar in the two stories is the enactment of the laws, and that there was a forced majority of Shammai, but there's no killing in the Bavli. So the commentaries.
There was a reference.
The commentaries on the next page provide disagreements. Some say that deaths actually occurred. These are commentators on the Yerushalmi, on the Jerusalem Talmud. The Pnei Moshe says Hillel had to sit subjugated before Shammai while Beit Shammai killed students of Beit Hillel, which is how Beit Shammai acquired the majority of the Beit Midrash. The Meiri says the 18 laws were enacted and will live forever because lives were lost on that day. He also suggests that the murders went beyond Beit Hillel and were quite widespread. He doesn't know, but that's his conclusion. Evidence from the Cairo Geniza says that a fast day was established in Adar due to the death of the students of Beit Hillel. The evidence from the Cairo Geniza says that it was the 4th of Adar. The Shulchan Aruch lists this as an additional fast that some have observed, but says it was on the 9th of Adar. That there are alternative interpretations.
Do you know what they call the day?
No. No, I only know the Shulchan Aruch says that there was
What about your say?
the 9th of Adar.
9th of Adar.
Well,
So that's what I call it.
the Korban Ha'idah says that Beit Shammai only threatened, that's another typo, Beit Hillel to stay downstairs so that Beit Shammai could have the majority in the Beit Midrash. Sadia Gaon, who was a post-Talmudic Gaon, says the sages taught in a Braita, a person should always be patient like Hillel and not impatient like Shammai. That should be Talmud Bavli Shabbat 30b. And he provides a proof text from later in the Babylonian Talmud, where he says, "And the sages taught about those who are insulted and do not insult, who hear their shame and do not respond, who act out of love and are joyful in suffering." The verse says, "And they that love him are the sun going forth in its might." So then I provide some historical context. Avraham Zakuto was an historian who wrote in the 15th and 16th century. These events took place around the time of Herod, who maintained good relations with Rome, sent his children to be educated there, and who was dubbed by the Romans as the friend and ally of Rome. This gave Herod a period of tranquility in which he had time to build great structures, including renovating the Second Temple. According to Zakuto, who writes in one of the first Jewish books on history, Sefer Yochassim, Herod built the temple of a beauty that exceeded that of Solomon. The connection to Solomon here, I think, is actually striking, given what we just studied in the earlier session. But this expansion into aesthetics brought with it some mixed feelings amongst the rabbis because they were fearful of this new secular Greek influence. It appears, however, that Hillel was quite supportive of Herod, while Shammai felt threatened by the secular cosmopolitanism of Herod. Zacuto continues, indeed, Herod greatly respected Hillel, for they supported his rule. The disciples of the school of Shammai were killing the disciples of Hillel and threatened their lives. Rav Binyamin Lau was the nephew of the former chief rabbi of Israel and head of the Beit Midrash at Beit Morashah and the head of the 929 website, which is a really interesting website for a study of Tanakh.
He's contemporary.
Yeah, he's a modern. 929 website is still existing.
He also wrote the 4 volumes on the biographies of the sages.
Yeah. At this stage, the Jewish forces were split and turned against each other in a civil war between the supporters of Herod and the supporters of the Hashmoneans. Besides their political differences, though, Shammai was always stricter than Hillel. Shammai, for example, taught that children should not eat on a fast day, as apparently the custom had always been. Hillel's leniency and innovation was that fasting should only be observed after puberty. This is all from Beni Lau. Another example is that Shammai only believed in teaching respectable people, while Hillel believed in teaching all people. When Hillel first arrived in Israel, he found the Torah world to be closed and elitist, and we all know the story of him having to climb onto the roof in the freezing snow to listen to Torah because he could not afford an entrance fee to the Beit Midrash. We'll skip over the next section. We already talked about that. So now it's time for some discussion. So the first question is, how do we reconcile this with what we've been taught about Hillel and Shammai our whole lives? So specifically, in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, Kol machloket shehi l'shem shamayim safa lehitkayem. In the end, every dispute that is for the sake of heaven will endure. B'she'eno l'shem shamayim ein safa lehitkayem. But if it's not for the sake of heaven, it won't endure. And then the Mishnah says, Ezo hi machloket shehi l'shem shamayim. So what's a controversy for the sake of heaven? And so the Mishnah gives an example. Zo machloket Hillel v'Shammai. So questioning between Hillel and Shammai is deemed to be for the sake of heaven. V'she'ena l'shem shamayim zo machloket Korach v'chol adato. So Korach and Bnei Korach, that was a controversy that was not for the sake of heaven. And how do we reconcile this with this famous line in the Talmud, Neruvim, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chayim, that the words of Hillel and the words of Shammai were both words of the living Torah?
See, we're puzzling on this from the Yerushalmi, right? You say, you're talking about the violence. If I'm not mistaken, in the Mishnah it says that the Hillel and Shammai, they would marry each other's daughters, right, and they would eat together, notwithstanding all their differences, including differences over kashrut, right? and that you can't reconcile that the Yerushalmi here saying, not killing each other, but each other.
I'm going to kill myself. I should have written these down because I always forget them. In the case of the issue of marriage, Rashi says that that's a Baba Maisa, that yes, they did intermarry. Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai did intermarry, but they never would intermarry if there were a question of mamzerut, if there were a question of a possibly becoming a bastard, having improper.
That's going against the shot of
The Mishnah, but it's Rashi's commentary, and I forget there are 3 such things. 2 of them Rashi's.
Opposed to Yerushalmi. So the Yerushalmi is basically,
Rashi says that in the 3 cases where Hillel agrees with Shammai, there were limitations on what Hillel was saying, which is probably consistent with the way Rashi viewed halacha, not necessarily, a pure reading of the Mishnah, a pure reading of the Talmud. So, why do we have this text?
Isn't there a problem that is perpetual, that we deal with all the time when you're trying to consider justice? The problem with Kavura, and the other is, what is it? Not Rahmanis, it's, what is it?
Chesed.
Chesed, thank you. Chesed and Kavura. And you have Shammah and you have Hillel that represent two poles.
There's Gevura and there's violence. This is not just Gevura, this is Hamas. This is, why do we have, why is the story so extreme?
Clearly, the editors of the Bible didn't want it erased.
But even in the Bavli, it's, there was a forced majority through the sword. So even in the Bavli, there was a threat of violence. It's still an extreme story.
So is there some kind of a warning?
It's not there's not an intellectual story. There's so little intellectual disputation involved here.
Right.
There's like none, right? And the other 17 edicts, there's no discussion whatsoever. It's just shot. And
Is there something at stake in this particular one that differs from the other 70 cases?
I mean, this is, this is a matter of ritual purity, so trivial.
So is there perhaps some kind of a warning, though,
That's where I come out. That's where I come out. That we have this story, just like we have the golden calf story, and just like we have the story of, in Malachim Aleph, of Yerovam and Rechavam, to warn us about internecine violence, to warn us about factionalism, to warn us about not being empathic to the other. That's where I come out. Now, how?
Now, could it, but if that's the, I mean, so yeah, I see that, right? On the other hand, I suppose, stylistically, it could have been written a little bit more, a little differently for committing in terms of laying the groundwork.
That's for sure.
It sort of comes out of nowhere, right? It's
I mean, you would
Yeah.
think that there would be more debate.
right.
There's so little debate in this, though. It's raw power. It's raw power.
You think it'd be a bill to show the warning, but an escalation, right? You think that they frame it, that there's some dispute, could be over, like they say, academic disputes, those are the most vicious over the most trivial thing, whatever, but building to an escalation where, say, and leading to violence, and, but saying, come on, this is nothing that could possibly justify this. But
I mean,
anyway, that's the way I see it.
I mean, the only other thing I see here is kind of like the sop to the northern kingdom in Malachim Aleph, which is, part of the whole Yerovam story. Maybe it was important to the editors of the Talmud that without giving up the intellectual primacy of Hillel, that they show some kind of deference to Shammai. Now, they did it in an extreme way, but maybe it was important to them
Mr. Stepp, how's that a sop to the northern kingdom?
because Yerovam succeeded. The story is written that the northern kingdom, was able to rebel and take all of Israel but Judah.
And you're tying Yerushalmi into that.
Well, clearly there's a reference to the golden calf story in both Talmuds. That this, it says this was as bad as the golden calf. So it's
Yeah, but why does that necessarily have to be in conversation with Malachim and not just
Yeah, yeah, I was
True,
gonna say,
true,
you
fair.
need a reference to Shmuel, not Malachim, I mean, that.
Okay, so it's a sop it's a sop to B'nai Aaron. Right, the golden, because Aaron survives as the high priest. So maybe that's the answer.
And therefore, we learn that we go with Beit Hillel because we don't want to be like the violent Beit Shammai. Like, what's the nimshal?
I think we go with Beit Hillel because he's intellectually superior, and that's how I want to end, by tying this to Shavuot. And I want to read from this book, which is written by Rabbi Dahlia Marks. It's an analysis, a month-by-month analysis of Jewish life. And like there's a poem of the month, the prayer of the month, some philosophical issue, and it's translated by our friend Peretz Rodman from Hebrew to English.
Rob's parents, you get this.
I'd actually like to read this in Hebrew. So she provides the following on the very next page of the Talmud after in the Bavli, in the Babylonian Talmud. She says, the following story provides a sharp example of the different approaches of various sages to converts in the desire to become Jews. Okay? It happened that a certain non-Jew came before Shammai. He said to him, this is, by the way, was anyone in Abby Gilman's session? She quoted this also. He said to him, convert me on condition that you teach me the whole Torah while I stand on one foot. It's famous sugya. Shammai pushed him away with the builder's cubit that was in his hand. When he went before Hillel, he said to the potential convert, what is hateful to you? Do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. It's Be'ahavta l're'echa kamocha. That is the whole Torah, and the rest is commentary. Go and learn it. So this is on Shabbat 31a. The story of threatened violence is on Shabbat 30b, the immediate prior page. Shammai understood, so this is Dahlia Marx's commentary. Shammai understood the non-Jew's request to learn the whole Torah while he stood on one foot as an indication of an insulting, dismissive attitude towards Judaism. And so Shammai sent him away. An unreasonable position. Shammai's saying, you want to be part of us? You got to dig deep. Okay? Hillel, in contrast, Hillel took the man seriously and taught him the principle seemingly so simple that he should not do to someone else what he himself despised. That is the entire Torah, he said. Now go and deeply delve into it. He was saying it in a positive way rather than a negative way. He's saying, you want to deal with us, go dig deep, but it has to be presented as a matter of respect and in a positive manner. The Talmud presents the two positions without saying which one is right, which is the Talmud's way. Not always, but most times. But the text highlights Hillel's reaction in response to both the non-Jew's request and to Shammai's response, and it seems that the Talmud sides with Hillel. Indeed, this is in line with the fact that in the many disputes between the two sages, it is Hillel's position that is usually accepted. Not only is Hillel's position usually accepted, but the history of Jewish law, the history of halakha relating to conversion throughout the generations has become more and more widely accepted. Although maybe we should say, like Martin Luther King, it bends to, the arc of history bends to the notion of acceptance because there are some exceptions that are unfortunate. But I think that we have this story, and it's particularly appropriate to teach it on Shavuot because Rav Kook, the first essentially chief rabbi of Israel, not as Israel but as the Yishuv, always said that his favorite holiday was Shavuot. Why? because it was a time in which Torah could become accessible to everyone. And so it was Rav Kook, who was, a great believer in the notion that we should be able to talk to anyone. So he was widely criticized by the rabbis in Jerusalem because he would talk to secular Jews. But Rav Kook said, on Shavuot, it's a time of great unity because the Torah is accessible to everyone. And so I think that's what Hillel is saying. And I think that we have this story because we reject the notion that we take this pure power position. Our position is a position based on intellectual dispute. And, whatever wins the day intellectually is what wins the day. And I think that should be the message of Matan Torah, that we have a tradition in which we engage with the text in a constructive way, in an empathic way, and in a way that's not designed to produce factions. It's designed to produce unity. And unfortunately, it doesn't always work that way, but I think that's the intelligent design of the system.
Scott?
Very good.
Don't you think that Shammai said something that might be found in Proverbs that says that you really shouldn't engage in conversing with a fool? And the fool is such a fool that, I don't know how it works. I'm just paraphrasing things that have come through my head. You're wasting your time talking to a fool. There are some verses about
Yeah, I mean, there are.
Proverbs about fools. There's a bunch of them. There was a talk by a woman who used to teach at Yale, who now is at the Hartman Institute.
Christine Hayes.
Kristen Hayes.
Christine
There's
Hayes,
a- on YouTube,
She's-
you
she's a-
can find it. She
She's
has
a non-Jewish Talmud scholar.
I know. But she gave a very interesting comparison of two verses, or maybe three, in Proverbs that seem to contradict each other.
Yeah.
And she wanted to talk about fools and how seriously you should take a fool. And I think Shammai is of that particular opinion in that very famous, his rejection of talking to a person.
Well, it's kind of interesting. Was anybody at Arnie's session on
No.
Habakkuk?
No.
Well, he talked about, we started out with, so the rabbis kind of play this game themselves. They started out with